be. And I think thus far you and David have gotten it spot on insofar as what the ramping up of U.S. sanctions could look like. So if you could you take a moment and explain a little bit about, people talk about oil sanctions as being a possible next step at a certain point, but can you explain what is meant, what the effects would be of sanctions on the export to Venezuela of diluent, and why, kind of what the effects would be for Venezuela, and why this would be a kind of a potential precursor to kind of outright oil sanctions?
Yes, I mean the one of the reasons why I think the oil embargo has not been imposed, despite the apparent willingness of President Trump of imposing very tough sanctions on Venezuela, is partly the effect of the domestic challenge from the Gulf states of the U.S., Texas, Louisiana, etc., against imposing the import embargo, because that will affect the heavy oil that they receive from Venezuela will be difficult to get from elsewhere. It will be more costly, etc. But these other sanctions are easier to implement, because they are much more limited in the effects in the U.S. And they, basically it will affect between 150 to 100,000 barrels. I mean, it has varied between 100 and 200,000 barrels month by month, but basically about half of it is typically used for the Venezuelan domestic market, which of course is crazy, because it's sold at a negative. It basically sold at less than zero, because they have to to incur some cost in order to distribute that products inside Venezuela. So that if that happens, that will affect some of the supplies. Probably there will be some rationing inside Venezuela on some products. But on top of that, it affects the diluents to blend with the extra heavy oil. Venezuela produces a type of oil that is so heavy that it requires blending with a lighter oil or product, and that could affect up to 300,000 barrels of extra heavy oil being exported, which is a very significant amount if you consider that Venezuela is exporting around 1.1 at the most million barrels, and even though they could be substituted from elsewhere that is not the U.S., for example, diluents could be imported from Russia. It will be very costly and not very attractive. So this will have additional effects on the already crumbling oil industry, and of course the Conoco situation is also already affecting significantly the exports from Venezuela. So they face a very tough situation in the next few months.
Beatriz, going back, I'd like your thoughts. As Francisco was just outlining the potential road ahead on sanctions, and going back to our conversation on what the international community could be doing, should be doing to best support the Venezuelan people right after this illegitimate vote yesterday. And as you were just mentioning before, Beatriz, the expectation of further government repression now that Maduro feels emboldened by yesterday's. I don't want to say yesterday's results, because the results are the government's results, but emboldened by what transpired yesterday. Beatriz, what would you say? What further action, from your perspective, as a defender of human rights, someone who works very closely with the migrants and refugees and is on the ground every day, what further action should the international community take from your perspective? What would be most helpful, whether it's sanctions or other types of efforts for the international community at this point?
Yes, well, it's very a complex situation that we have here, but I think the most important that we need is put or maintain Venezuela in the international agenda, because I know there are many dramas in the world, but Venezuela still being a very complex situation that needs a regional response. And in the field of migration and the situation of refugees, it's important to understand that after this election, it's going to increase. And we have different projections that is going to be the double of the migration that we have, the forced migration that we have, because it's not voluntary, it's a forced migration. And it's very important to put, the resource and the efforts that not just to attend the problematic in the borders. It's important to focus on what is happening inside of Venezuela, because there are many resources and they're putting money to help to the borders, but the cause of that consequence is in Venezuela. And it's important to do not forget that the problem is inside of Venezuela, and the humanitarian help and all the support that the international community can give could be thinking in Venezuela, not only in consequence that we are seeing with the high increase of the migrations. And also, I think that the pressure and the target sanctions are the measures that avoid the suffering of the Venezuelan, because the oil sanctions or all kind of people, the sanctions that could be affect more the economy, could have an impact, direct impact in Venezuelans. And right now we are suffering. Those kind of measures can be generate more suffering in Venezuelans.
Beatriz, if I heard you correctly, you said that you expect that the refugee and migrant outflows to potentially double.
Yes,
is that what you said?
There are the different projections of different NGOs or universities that are about thinking about this phenomenon. And it's so sad because if you ask Venezuelans right now, they don't have hope. And this is the most difficult situation, lead with the lack of hope of Venezuelans, because we have learning that there is no way to live this situation, and we have to recover that hope, to understand that we have to still fight in Venezuela. This is the most difficult situation, and it's something like what are the Venezuelans are feeling, and they're feeling that we don't have hope. That's why all the efforts is to support, to help Venezuelans to understand that we have to get organized and we have to work to recover our democracy and to save people that is dying and is suffering in this moment because the humanitarian situation.
I'm going to open up to questions from the speakers in just a moment, but just to add a little bit more context, and I want to go back to you, Francisco, before we open up to questions, but just to add a little more context on what Beatriz is saying for those who are not as closely following the migrant and refugee numbers. You have UNHCR estimating that between 1.5, 1.6 million Venezuelans have left the country, and that was through December of 2017. People, as they leave Venezuela, are going, of course, to Brazil, going to Colombia with migration in 2017, and so far in 2018 in Colombia, about 800,000 refugees and migrants is our estimates. But then beyond there too, Argentina, which has received 82,000, Chile 160,000, Peru almost 300,000. And the numbers go on and on. For the U.S., for its part, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services says that almost 30,000, 27,600 Venezuelans requested asylum in fiscal year 2017, which is a 400% increase over the last 2 years. So that gives some context for people on the call on what those numbers, and there's projections of those of the 5,000 people leave a day, according to UNHCR, to Brazil and Colombia, and that's under the current situation. That's not under a situation in which the economic crisis significantly worsens than the humanitarian crisis. Francisco, I want to turn it back to you for a last question before I open up to everyone on the call. We've been talking about sanctions. Beatriz was discussing from her perspective how sanctions could be implemented in a way that further puts pressure on the government and minimizes effect on the people. But what is, Francisco, you're following this very closely. What do you see the government doing already to circumvent or adapt to the sanctions regime? How is it also preparing for the possibility of more sanctions to come?
Yeah, not only sanctions, but the Conoco situation shows that we could be seeing a lot more creditors trying to seize assets and cargo from PDVSA. They seem pretty unprepared to manage the Conoco injunctions in the islands in the Caribbean, but they seem to be at this point following the following strategy. First, selling everything